Maxx, one of the most powerful cards in the history of the card game. This card on its own warps formats and changes the entire dynamic of the game completely, which is why it's currently banned in the TCG and has been banned for nearly 6 years. But what exactly makes the card so powerful, and why has it been banned in the TCG all of this time? Well, today we're gonna look into that. What's good, YouTube? It's me, coming back in the next video. Let's talk about Maxx, starting off with the history of Maxx. It was a dark and stormy day when Maxx was first released on February 8th in 2011. Surprisingly, it was released as a TCG exclusive, meaning we got it before the OCG did, and nobody really played it upon its release. It was just not the type of card that did anything because special summoning was not super prevalent in the game. The game was a lot slower. There were not a lot of special summoning, certainly not 20 plus special summons like we have today, and certainly a lot of these special summons were not ones that started chains, so you were not easily able to chain Maxx to an effect and get some value, which didn't really make it worth it. And because the game was a lot slower, there were a lot of traps flying around. This is before we had a lot of other hand traps. Basically, Valor and Maxx were the only played hand traps. We didn't have anything crazy like Ash Blossom, Imperm, stuff like that. And if you dropped Maxx preemptively, all the other player had to do was pass their turn, set a bunch of traps, and you weren't winning on your turn either because none of the decks were combo heavy enough to easily OTK, especially not through trap cards. And so Maxx was kind of relegated to the side deck to be brought in specifically against combo heavy decks like Six Samurai at the time that actually started chains with their special summoning and spammed the board with their monsters to set up a bunch of Omni Negates like legendary Six Samurai Shien. However, within about a year, the cards started seeing more and more play because there were new cards coming out with the advent of power creep that led to a lot more special summons. We had Tengu Plant with the release of Reborn Tengu, a card that special summoned multiple copies from the deck over and over and also started a chain, which you could actually stifle with Maxx. It meant that a lot more players were actually favoring using this bug. And there were a lot of other cards like Lone Fire Blossom, Tour Guide from the Underworld, a lot of things that special summon in the plant decks. And then from there, we just had a plethora of new cards that just love special summoning. We had decks like Dino Rabbit, we had Insectors, Windups. In fact, Windups was one of the driving forces of actually playing Maxx. Maxx was not that great against Dino Rabbits or against Insectors because they did not have to special summon more than once. And Windup was the only deck that kind of spammed the board and did the hand loop, and Maxx was one of the only cards that actually prevented that and allowed you to live to see a turn. This eventually led to Maxx being a mainstay staple in every deck, a lot like how Ash Blossom is today. This was basically like the 3-up slot that you put into every deck, and then you played with 37 other cards. So Maxx eventually got semi-limited in the TCG in 2016, before eventually getting limited in 2017, which was even worse because whoever had the Maxx as a one-of and got lucky enough to see it was in a very favorable position going first and second. And then finally in 2018, Maxx was thankfully banned in the TCG. So now here are some of my arguments against Maxx actually coming back to the TCG. But first, let's take a look at this from a higher level. What exactly does Maxx do? Well, this card says during either player's turn, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard as a cost. This turn, each time your opponent special summons a monster, you immediately draw one card, and it's a hard once per turn. And obviously, if you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh, you know that the modern level of the game, due to power creep, is just consistent special summoning. We have decks that special summon 20, even 30 times per turn on the first turn, and obviously Maxx would just mean your opponent draws basically all the cards they need to break whatever board that you put onto the table. Now, part of the reason why this card is especially unfair is because it's what's called a blanket effect. It's basically a lingering effect that you place onto the board state for the rest of that turn, and you guys know we already have some cards that do that, which are all quite broken. We have cards like Dimension Shifter, which banishes all cards for the turn. It's very, very arguably ban-worthy. We also have Abyss Dweller, shuts off the graveyard for the entire turn. Also potentially ban-worthy, honestly, as long as we have a deck that can consistently make Dweller. For example, in Tournament's format in the Mirror Match, Dweller was the only thing that was wrecking the Mirror Match from being super skillful. And then, of course, cards like Drone Lockbird that impose the restriction where no players can add from their deck to the hand for the rest of the turn, and that's also quite devastating against decks that add from the deck to the hand. But that being said, all of the effects that we just mentioned can somewhat be played around. You don't necessarily require your graveyard to still make somewhat of a mini board or one interruption at the very minimum through cards like Shifter or Dweller that shut off the graveyard. For example, in the Snake Eye deck, you just go summon Ash, summon out Poplar, search for Field Spell, place Oak, make IP Masquerena. We still have SP or potentially Appaloosa, even into a Shifter. Same kind of deal for Drone Lockbird. The boards are still, for the most part, being able to put up at least one disruption despite not being able to add from your deck to your hand. And of course, our opponent loses a card in the interaction with both D-Shifter and Drone Lockbird, so it's still getting some value for the player on the opposing side. But then for Maxx C number 1, this shuts off special summoning completely, which is a core game mechanic that's required to put up any sort of interactions in the modern Yu-Gi-Oh metagame. Under Draw, under Shifter, players are still able to put up a board, but they have to special summon, right? Like, they're shutting off the graveyard, that's fine, but they're still special summoning. Maxx C, however, is special summoning. Your opponent will get at least one exchange with Maxx C, probably 9 out of 10 times, where Maxx C is being chained to an effect that would special summon, therefore allowing the opposing player to replace their Maxx C, so they're not going negative like they would for Drone Lockbird or D-Shifter. And then on top of that, it imposes a restriction. So they're getting the value back off of Maxx C, and they're getting a free condition that says, basically, your opponent can't special summon, or else you're gonna give me more advantage as this Maxx C resolves. And then when you think about it, at least 2 special summons is just a pot of greed, effectively, which is just way too powerful, especially when they're going second. Next is the fact that Maxx C allows the player to draw, which means they can draw into further disruptions. It's not like we're guaranteed to OTK our opponent under Maxx C when they're playing a lot of other hand traps like Ash Blossom, Valor, Nibiru, cards that they can draw into as we play more and more further into the Maxx C, and then have a higher chance for them to actually stop us from playing into the Maxx C and OTKing, because it's drawing you more cards, it's drawing you more resources, and it's drawing you more disruptions that you can just sling onto the table at any point in time. I know a lot of players are saying, you know, going second in Yu-Gi-Oh is so unfair. We need a card that allows us to go second. Maxx C is that exact card. Well, this is not quite the case, because there's a counter argument to this. When you go first, Maxx C is just equally as good and as detrimental to the game. Consider this: you're going first, you're the turn player, you make a huge board with Omni Negates, and then you have Maxx C in your hand. So your opponent wants to play through their board, they're going second, they're already at a disadvantage, they go for the turn, and you draw Maxx C. The Maxx C resolves, and now as a player under Maxx C, it's very difficult because you have to special summon to break your opponent's board, but you're also under Maxx C, so they're going to be replenishing their resources. If you don't kill them, they're going to kill you on the crackback. They're going to be drawing a bunch of resources. If you do not win on this turn, on the consecutive turn with all the cards that they have amassed up Maxx C, they're guaranteed to win, basically. And then on top of that, you have to deal with the board, which means that they still have disruptions on the board and cards that they're drawing into their hand that could be hand traps. So you basically have a lot to deal with. Then on top of all of that, there could be potential Omni Negates on the board that guarantee Maxx C will resolve. You might have cards like Crossout Designator or Called by the Grave, Ash Blossom, that just get negated by their Omni Negate when you try to stop the Maxx C, because they know that if they draw a bunch of cards, you're not going to be able to win that turn, and if you don't win that turn, then they can win no matter what with their grip full of like 40 cards. I've seen some people say, yeah, in the right deck, you know, you can deck out your opponent by special summoning a bunch of times under Maxx C. But again, they're drawing to hand traps, so they can kind of control the pace of the game. They're guaranteed to draw into hand traps at some point because, you know, diminishing returns. They're playing a bunch of hand traps. Nowadays, we're playing like between 15 and even 20 hand traps. They will see it at some point, guys. This is why draw the out is not an excuse for Maxx C to come back. But now here's the question. Maxx C has obviously been in the OCG since its release, and it's been at 3 the whole entire time. Why is their metagame so different than ours? What makes it so that they can have Maxx C? And honestly, I have no idea. Personally, I think Maxx C should be banned completely, and I think a lot of OCG players are inclined to agree. Looking at some of these tweets from the previous YCS Japan, which was a tournament composing of 8,000 players and best of 1 rounds, a lot of the complaints on Twitter were about Maxx C being just too sacky of a card. You know, your opponent had a Maxx C, you had no answers, or your opponent had a board plus Maxx C. This is the reason why players were losing, all because of Maxx C. Now, an interesting thing to note is that in the OCG, they have quite a few outs for Maxx C. They have quite a few answers. They have 2 Called by the Grave, 1 Crossout Designator, 3 Ash Blossom. That's already 6 cards that can directly trade with Maxx C. And on top of that, you can technically consider Maxx C to be a counter to Maxx C because you can just stop playing, you know, just pass your turn and then drop Maxx C on your opponent. So that technically is an answer to a Maxx C because it forces them to pass back, assuming they don't have an answer. Now, it's a little bit weaker than, let's say, Crossout Designator or Called by or Ash, because the chances of your opponent having those cards against your Maxx C on their turn is potential as well. But still, that puts between 6 to 9 potential disrupts to Maxx C directly in their actual format. So it's not guaranteed that Maxx C is always going to resolve. And then on top of that, there are other hand traps that allow a player to pass the turn through Maxx C and still be able to put up some defenses and hopefully get another turn where Maxx C is no longer under effect. But all of that being said, it still creates non-games where Maxx C is being dropped. So any game that a certain player doesn't have an answer to Maxx C, the chances of them winning get deteriorated significantly because Maxx C is in effect and you're basically skipping one player's turn. This is kind of the same ideal in Master Duel, especially in the best of one format, where anytime Maxx C is resolving, a lot of times it just creates a non-game where it's just won by Maxx C itself. The other issue with Maxx C is that it restricts deck building significantly. Nowadays, a lot of players prefer having a diversity, and obviously deck building and creativity is a big part of this game, just as much as it is playing the actual game. It severely limits deck building because every deck basically starts off with 31 cards if you think about it, with Maxx C legal, because you jam 3 Maxx C, it's the best card, you have to play it. But because Maxx C is the best card and everyone's playing it, you have to play cards that stop Maxx C. So you have to go in 3 Ash Blossom, and then also in goes in, you know, the Called by the Graves and the Crossout Designator. So depending on how many of those cards you have in the format, that dictates X being the number that you shave off of a deck before actually deck building, because you have to throw those cards into the deck to accommodate for Maxx C being a thing. So back in the day, obviously every deck would just put in 3 Maxx C. There was no Ash Blossom or Called by at the time, but basically every deck started out with 37 cards because you just had to play 3 Maxx C. And I personally feel like if Maxx C came back now, we would definitely be playing 3 Crossout, 1 Called by, 3 Ash, and 3 Maxx C in every deck, which makes it so that our decks are basically 30 cards. In the past, we've also had players take advantage of Maxx C being a level 2 insect and using ways to abuse it in the right deck. For example, in Sprites, they could dump it off of Sprint, bring it back off of Elf, bounce it back to their hand. They could bring it back something like Herald of the Purelight to their hand. There were decks that play the Retaliating Sea that allows you to search for Maxx C. All of these combos, while creative and cool, still creates a very toxic board state because of the fact that, you know, Maxx C is the card that they're digging for, and that card just says the other player cannot play. It's honestly just one of the most powerful floodgate cards that can be used on turn 0 and just has no drawback. There's basically 0 drawback to having this card in your deck. It also forces other hand traps away from the format. For example, if you look at the OCG, part of the reason why no one's really playing Nibiru is because of Maxx C, which stops your opponent from special summoning, meaning they're not going to reach 5 summons for that turn, and Nibiru is more than often than not just dead in your hand, right? So not a lot of players play Nibiru, but it also means in the case where you don't have Maxx C and your opponent is going for game and summoning more than 5 times, and you don't have Nibiru because you're not playing it, so it creates like a very, very awkward balance, forcing out other hand traps that we're already quite used to in the TCG, and that I think are fairly balanced compared to Maxx C. Like, I would way rather take a Nibiru, especially because a lot of decks can play through Nibiru, and, you know, it promotes a lot of skill in that aspect where you're playing around Nibiru, you're playing around other hand traps that are not necessarily a lingering condition, but hand traps that are just 1-for-1 trades, and then from there you kind of adapt your game. Whereas Maxx C, you can't really adapt to that. Like, yeah, you can maybe try and make a board and pass and have hand traps, but that's really the only linear game plan that you can go for. You cannot actually tweak your game plan accordingly, unlike cards like Nibiru or Effect Failure, Imperm, and so on and so forth. So overall, for me, Maxx C just promotes too many non-games, and I feel like this is not the type of card that we want in the TCG anytime soon. Am I wrong? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on Maxx C. Would you like to see this card come back? Should Maxx C come back to the TCG? Let me know in the comments. I mean, I obviously don't, but hey, I have 3 Ultimate Rares in my binder. If it does come back, I would give it a try for sure. I'd play it along with the rest of the world. But guys, I want to hear your thoughts on that specifically. Let me know in the comments below. Smash that like button and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Bye-bye.